know me, I'm Nicola Ansell. I work at Brunel University. And I was asked me to, what's the word? I don't know, organise one of the workshops this afternoon. And the workshop's going to be about theorising age and the life course. And I think it connects really well in with what Michael was talking about earlier, and also with the discussion that we had following that. I didn't sort of contribute to that discussion, partly because Sharada actually said exactly what I wanted to say, and partly because I thought I don't really want to preempt this afternoon completely. So anyway, where this came from, Afua asked me, I don't know, or Chair asked me a week or so ago to come up with an abstract. And I was like, oh gosh, what am I going to do? What should this be about? So there were two things that sort of came into my head that I've been thinking about over the last couple of months or so. Well, one of them over the last couple of months, the other was probably last week. One was that back in November I went to a conference in Zimbabwe on child-centred social policy, and there was a huge amount of discussion there around the legal age for marriage, minimum age for marriage, and the age for sexual consent. And there was a very, very strong consensus, particularly from the Zimbabweans at this conference, that both should be raised to 18. There were young people at the conference, and they were very, very fully pushing this raising of the age of marriage and age of consent to 18. And I suppose as a British academic in this setting, I found it a little uncomfortable intervening in that and saying, hey, but, you know, is that really going to work? And then I think it was last week or a couple of weeks ago that I first circulated this letter to the UN General Assembly's discussions around the proposed general comments on the rights of adolescents, relating to specifically what Michael was talking about earlier, the entrenching of the Convention 138 minimum age for work in this new sort of UN declaration. And again, the problematic aspects of age, but the pressures to use age as a sort of defining, universal approach to life course. In terms of this workshop, we're thinking about theory, we're thinking about what are useful theories, we're thinking about whether the theory that's applicable to southern childhoods might be different or need to be, or whether universal or northern perspectives on childhood, theories of childhood are applicable, what the outcomes of those are. But I want to put that in the context of globalisation. This is a slide that I just threw together and thrown into here this morning. And I'm sort of stealing from Fernanda back there, this translating needs into demands, which I think perhaps is a really useful, but perhaps also problematic or incomplete way of thinking about theory. But what we want theory to do, we want to be able to translate the needs, particularly of young people in marginalised communities, into demands for change, demands for response, or perhaps demands for not that response. But to think about that in this context of globalisation, of potential economic exploitation in the global economy, that perhaps came out of some of the discussion at the end of this morning's session. Exploitation of work. In some ways, whether that's defined as economic work or reproductive work is almost irrelevant. It plays a functional role in the global economy. So if we look at it in Olga Neuenhausen's terms, it is sustaining the global economy. It is sustaining an economy in which rich world children do not need to work. And also thinking of the value of universal concepts in making claims. And again, some of the contributions this morning suggested that maybe there is a utility to having some sort of universal standard to appeal to in translating needs into demands. Or on the other hand, is this, after what Ginny was talking about yesterday, is it just a sort of mirroring of northern concepts? Is it about just a class position that was being perhaps expressed, for example, at the conference that I went to in Zimbabwe at the end of last year? So, concepts of age and the life course, clearly these are multiple, and they might be multiple and sitting side by side. They might be chronological, they might be considered in fluid terms or binary terms, or they might be contextualized. We might think about transition, we might think of a sort of single point of moving from childhood to adulthood. So what I'd like this workshop to consider is three basic sort of questions. What is the value of universal concepts of life courses that are based on chronological age? We can see that chronological age is a very obvious and easy thing to seize upon to come up with a universal standard. What is the value of situated conceptualizations for the life course? And are there ways of theorising life course that can have political salience in a globalising world that are perhaps not chronological? That might, I'm sort of interested to see what discussion comes out of this and whether we can actually move towards that, or whether that is just an impossible thing. I feel asked us in these workshops to address at least two of the central questions of the overall workshop. So the two that I propose that this should address are the first one, how, if at all, do theoretical concepts related to childhood research in the North transfer to various social, cultural and political contexts in the Global South? I think perhaps what we're doing is questioning, we see that they already do transfer, but that throws up problems. What are the problems that are thrown up? And secondly, what challenges exist that may prevent the incorporation of theories developed by academics focusing on southern childhoods into more dominant discourses surrounding childhood studies? But I think also perhaps we want to think about what challenges there are that might prevent perhaps more nuanced theories from informing policy debate and informing interventions and what actually happens. So what I'd like us to do is really to take these three questions and have a sort of round the table quick discussion of those, stimulate a few ideas, and then break into groups and think about them in relation to specific issues. Actually, what I should have said at the beginning is, can we have somebody to take some notes so that we can feed back at 4:30? There's going to be a sort of plenary, so that we can feed this back to the people who are going to the other workshop and have a broader discussion of the issues arising. So, anyone happy to take some notes for us? I don't know whether it's useful to use the flip chart paper for this, or okay. So to start with then, the value of these sort of universal concepts of life course that are based on chronological age. What are the sort of positives and the negatives to that? Any thoughts? Do you see them as useful? you got examples of them being useful in some contexts or problematic?
I think if we have a chronological age limit for conceptualizing childhood, then we can have something based on from which we can, like for education or other policies, I mean, that makes our life easy to frame something based on chronological age from the policy makers, from academics' perspective. But if you consider from the children's perspective, like what is the difference between 13 years, 11 months and 14 years? I mean, if we say that 14 is the age for children who can work in our country, and what is the difference between 17 and a half and 18? So from that perspective, I mean, it limits the children's capacity or the needs of the children. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of children not being tried for offences, the idea of building capacs, I think it is, where they couldn't be tried by the colonial state if they were under 7 years of age. So there's some kind of understanding of children and I mean, it can be positive. The thing is to think about positive and negatives also in terms of an ideal world. And so I'm thinking of also early childhood education where it's an ideal thing to have. Chronological age in the sense of having a larger structural framework. But now the way that it's playing out in terms of school readiness is very problematic. So, so what I'm saying is to think of the positives in terms of an ideal situation, but to also separate it from the positives of how chronological age currently circulates, which might be more of an imposition, right? Okay. So would that be a negative?
So you're saying that it can be used in ways that are positive,
right?
But it's currently being used in ways that are problematic just because it's being used thoughtlessly, or?
It's being used a little kind of the idea of universal, right? So it's being used as the idea of good for all contexts without necessarily looking at the context itself. So maybe that comes in later, I don't know.
How do you contextualize a universal?
Well, but I think, I don't know if this necessarily fixes the problem, but if we hold universal concepts somewhat loosely, so like this is what we might see or might want to see, then it can be helpful. Schools are try to be modeled on kind of the developmental readiness of children based on their chronological age. So if we hold that loosely, then it can be helpful to teachers to prepare curriculum. But if we hold it rigidly, then we have students who are deemed unsuccessful, and it may have nothing to do with anything but for 7 they're a bit young, or for 7 they're a bit old, and the curriculum doesn't match their readiness very well, or the environment doesn't match their needs very well.
So is there a difference between applying it in a sense to society compared to applying it to every individual? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, or if we need a term that's not universal but implies more like generally useful but not
like guidelines.
Yeah, as opposed to a universal which implies more like a law of this is the way it always is, which isn't.
Yeah, for me, touching back on what you just said, for me, for example, in Vietnam, we don't have a very clear, we don't know clearly about at what age what children can do, something like that. It's not very sometimes we don't have a clear idea. But here I see at school, we have a very clear idea of at this age the child should be doing this and that. I think if we implement that rigidly, like at that age the child should be doing this and that, and if your child doesn't do it like that, it should be abnormal, and I think it should be like rigidly applying that concept. But it's good to have a reference of, like, if we have a research on the majority of the children at that age, they should be doing this and that. But if your child like has not been able to do some of that things, it should not be that your child is abnormal, but maybe your child has a certain development, like maybe in different routes. But good reference to know what are the skills that the children all the children or the majority of children have been learning or acquired at that age. I think positive and negative.
So in that context, it could be stigmatizing to those
Yes.
who are sort of seen as failing, or it could be a diagnostic tool to allow.
Yeah, I feel like it's good to have a reference, but it should not be like, that is how it should be, like that. It should like allow certain flexibility.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I'm not too sure how to handle this distinction between positive and negative. So I was trying to think how to structure this in my head. One of the things which comes to mind is the understanding of legal minority or the role of law in identifying children on the basis of chronological age. And in those terms, Sharda also said the age of criminal responsibility. And as you mentioned in your first slide, the age of marriage and sexual consent, these become legal problems or legal issues to be solved. And they function both at the individual level and at the societal level then.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
And that kind of affects both at the societal level and at the individual level then. So in those terms, if we are thinking of age, how to handle that or how to address that, where I guess it's no more of a positive or a negative. It's about implications then. What are the dominant ideas and how it is being played out in everyday real situations.
So if there's, I suppose actually one of the things, there's a sort of distinction between sort of saying ages are useful, or using age as a determining criterion in law, and using specific ages that are common globally are perhaps two different things. So there's a difference between sort of having your laws completely aligned to the laws of other countries in terms of the ages at which you permit or that you use as your sort of age of criminal responsibility. But then there's that extra thing of actually how it gets enacted and played out, and the consequences of that. Sorry, the sort of positive negative thing is just, I was just trying to sort of stimulate a discussion rather than necessarily saying that we can see it in totally, binary ways and
It seems to me there's something to do with biology versus or biology plus social aspect, isn't it? Because we know that biology is much more uniform and universal than social things. So if you were going purely by something that was very biological, but even then there's lots of variety. So if you take the age at which people are sexually mature or something like that, that is kind of roughly the same kind of range of times for children kind of going into adolescence everywhere kind of thing. But then you've got all the social. So if you wanted to make something universal, you could make it on the basis of biology. But of course that doesn't work because you've got social context. So that's where it's a social context that means it has to be relativist in a sense. So, and I think maybe that's sometimes the universal stuff is depending too much on always kind of, is led by the biology or by the sort of Piagetian psychology, that thinks that children learn things, are able to learn things at particular ages, when actually it's much more flexible. We know that children learn things or acquire skills in a particular order, but actually if you look at when they acquire them, there's a massive diversity.
Yeah.
So,
and that is, it's not, and it is partly socially determined as well as it's not inherent. I mean, as well as being socially variable, as well as being variable from individual to individual within a society. It varies between societies as well.
Exactly. I don't know if that's helpful, but it got me thinking, sort of.
But that's an interesting. Yeah, because I suppose I sort of set out with this thinking, you can't just dismiss age.
No.
Or life course. You can't sort of say, we can forget it completely.
There is a pattern to what children are able to do at different times. Well, what they do and then what they do later and what they do later. We know that, but it's just hugely variable. But I think the things, as soon as you make some sort of guideline, people use it in a too rigid way.
Yeah.
So you can make it saying it's a guideline. Everyone uses it as if it's a rule. That's the problem.
Well, and if you're a researcher who studies this progression, you're still going to have parents who are going to say, yes, but when are they going to do this?
Yeah. How many years above below the mean is my child? Yeah, exactly. But then that kind of attitude has been produced by this obsession with age-related stuff.
Two ideas that come up facing this question. One is that to answer that, maybe I was thinking it maybe it's different if we think this criteria for concept building. To theorize, to orient research. It's different from thinking this criteria for legislation or in terms of legal rights and how in public policy. And it's also different when you think about the value of chronological age in terms of dominant cultural and social criteria. So I think we are answering, and maybe there are important differences when we differentiate for what we are thinking. And the other idea is just complementing, I was wondering how much the neurological and psychological studies dialogue with sociological studies. In facing that question, how much we are actually interacting between these disciplines.
I would say not at all. That's part of it. It's a frustration. I went to a conference about child development in Istanbul just before Christmas. It was just such a frustration because there was no dialogue between. There were a small number of us who were taking a much more holistic picture of it, and then a whole mass of people who were obsessed with developmental screenings. And we couldn't. I came away from it deeply frustrated by the fact that I thought that the whole conference was going to address that dialogue and get some bringing together. It didn't happen at all.
Something that I maybe more a positive approach to it could be maybe not being so obsessed with the UNCRC age limit of 18, for example, as defining this is everyone below 18 as a child, and then we talk about children and we talk about people under the age of 18, but maybe looking more at what kind of age barriers matter to the people in the places we work in. Where when I was in Zanzibar, for example, which is a place that is 99% Muslim, the Quran and everything that the Quran teaches is very, very crucial to the way you raise your children and the way you live together. So for me, looking at corporal punishment and child protection, what was happening in that sector, very much in working a lot with sheikhs and imams, what was suggested most of the time was that, well, we can't just abolish corporal punishment, but because the Prophet was also raised in that way, and this is very crucial, and this was a very common argument, but we could maybe more look to what we are told in the Hadith, which tells us that we should only start warning children about having to pray, and we are only allowed to actually hit children from the age of 10. So maybe this is a very, very clear age distinction, and it is passed on exactly in these words in the Hadith, and people referred to it and used it, and it was actually helpful in terms of limiting corporal punishment for younger children below the age of 10, but from a very vernacular approach, and not so much of this, okay, we have to abolish corporal punishment for everybody, for all children under the age of 18, just totally the whole thing, stop at everybody, but looking at, oh, okay, we can still work with age, or look in what way age matters and how we can use it, but from a different kind of approach.
I think there is a sort of an issue there around whether 18 seems to be becoming more and more entrenched across all sorts of sectors. And that whether it's useful to think in terms of either sort of locally meaningful age limits for things, or perhaps even, I do wonder a little bit, I sort of broadly agree with what Michael says about Convention 138, and that age is in a sense a sort of, not the important criteria, but actually the idea of having age limits that are not specifically 18 in some ways seems quite progressive.
At least, and then this is again very, very relativistic, but that would be suggested out of the particular context that you're looking at, and not only coming from the UNSSE or something that's not applicable. So universities is why.
Before moving on to the next one, just to widen that context a little to the global, rather than, is there a value of universal conceptualizations, given that we live in not just local context, but a global context as well? Does globalization give some sort of value to universal constructs of age and life course?
I think in some communities that's where societies are actually still trying to work it out, because certainly what I found in Zambia is people are still trying to maintain these very traditional understandings of what it means to be a child or an adult, and what those kind of transitions look like. But then they're also trying to incorporate the more globalised international definitions. And it's almost becoming, I don't know if it's a class thing, a wealth thing, but you go to the rural areas or the kind of the compounds where they are still trying to promote, initiation and marriage and some of the more traditional ideas which don't necessarily follow the age side of things. But then they're trying to fit into a school system and projects funded up to the age of 18, and sort of work out where young people fit within that and outside of that as well. Whereas if you go to the wealthier side of town, they fit quite easily into kind of the concepts of childhood being up to the age of 18. It's been kind of more easily adopted, so you get these kind of discrepancies across beliefs, and trying to maintain both those kind of cultural understandings and the more globalised ones as well.
But are the globalised ones useful, or are they just being used to, are they committing violence against?
I don't know, yes and no. I think there's both views there.
Can we, sorry.
No, I was just going to say one thing. I think you see it much more in terms of it playing out in school context, with increasing numbers of children going to school, and school being kind of age and grade appropriate. There's much more an increasing need of birth certificates around that, and so kind of a lot of NGO work being around registering births, right? And so you see a definite shift towards a marking of chronological age in poorer communities, both in rural and urban areas, which is going to kind of intensify the minute they come into schools, right? And this, in some senses, in terms of, if you want to come back to the universal effect, at least it's been, the research has shown that when girls are in school for longer periods of time, early marriage doesn't happen, right? So there you see a much more definite sense of age, the age of the girl child vis-a-vis earlier understandings of marriage and a shift through schooling. So I think schooling is one of the dominant sites through which this universal understanding of chronological age is getting kind of circulated more widely.
So there's the sort of question whether it should be resisted, but
I mean, it's happening is all I'm saying. I'm not kind of critiquing it at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just a few minutes then to think if we can sort of come up with some different sorts of conceptualization or situation conceptualizations of life course, and whether or how valuable those are. In particular context. I mean, Caroline, you were talking about initiation and how does that work in?
But it's also changing now, but then that's more the education side of things coming in. So they're trying to still have it, but changing the messages that things like initiation promote. So instead of it being this natural progression that once they've been through initiation, they'll get married, it's, oh no, we don't teach them about sex and marriage anymore, we're teaching them that they have to stay in school and be good and and wait to get married. That's not necessarily, I think, always the case, but that's what we're kind of being told. So yeah.
So even perhaps some of these non-chronological ones are getting co-opted into a sort of chronological. Any other sort of experiences of non-chronological life course concepts? Yeah.
Just an example from Cuba, which you find elsewhere in Latin America, which is the idea, I suppose, taking the idea of the rite of passage, and the one which is kind of dominant, which is related to age, because it's Los 15, what the girl's 15th birthday. And that disappeared a little bit in Cuba in the 60s and 70s, but re-emerged in the 80s, and still it's an important ritual. Now, one of the paper I listened to recently, someone who's done research on funerals, said that there was a daughter who refused to pay for her father's funeral because he had not paid for their keeping. So it's an important. Now it's to do with age. This is 50, and yet it's not legal, it's not educational, it's cultural. So is there something? It's still age. We're still talking about the 15th birthday, but is there something kind of about culture which we need to kind of bring into the debate beyond education and law? So.
And that's. I think thinking about it in sort of north-south terms again, but it's Spanish, isn't it, in origin, I think?
Yeah, absolutely. It comes from 19th century kind of colonial structures. It's absolutely.
Even in the US, they have like kind of
Sweet 16,
right? Don't they? Like parties where.
It's more. I would say it's more specific to like particular cultural traditions. Like Jewish communities have special traditions. I suppose if you could count drinking at 21, then that would be, but like, that's not really, it's not like your family would all come and celebrate this with you.
But in the UK, it used to be 21, didn't it? Yeah. And now it's 18. We have an 18th birthday party, but it's still very much a number rather than.
Yeah. But there are some interesting situated conceptions of like the progression of your life course. I remember having some interesting conversations with some of the Ugandan researchers I was working with, asking when someone would become an adult. And at first they said, well, when you're 18, you're an adult when you're 18. And I said, so when you're 18, they're like, well, it's when you get married. Well, actually, it's when you have children. And so there was much more of a sense that, sure, yeah, it's 18, but culturally, it was much more predicated on a certain progression of events that would happen that could commence at 18 or 15 or 25, and so the chronology mattered less than the progression piece, which is what you were talking about.
Yeah. Certainly one of the things in Zambia which links back into what Ginny was talking about yesterday was motherhood was always an important transition, and it didn't matter really necessarily at what age that took place. You became an adult, whereas now it has shifted to being a teenage pregnancy issue, and so a lot of the young women I spoke to, even though they had children, said that they were still a child themselves because they weren't married. So then the marriage element became more important because it had changed to be having children out of wedlock was a negative thing if you were under the age of 18, whereas before it had been something to be celebrated. So that's kind of a shift there in terms of where that sort of globalized chronological association has gone, has changed how people are actually perceiving something that was quite natural and accepted and not challenged before. Which again can have positive and negative things. I was in Uganda with students last year, and there was a 14-year-old that almost died because she was having trouble actually delivering the baby. So, there's both sides to it, but it has kind of made it more underground in a sense and perceived more negatively to have had children before the age of 18.
But is it okay to be married before the age of 18, or is that?
That's changing as well. It depends where you are in the country, I think, and the cultural perception. There is certainly talk about how they're trying to reduce the amount of teenage marriage, but then on the other hand, it was still for some quite an important thing.
And it's also attached to schooling, though, in Uganda with the girls. It wasn't just that they got pregnant, because that was not necessarily a bad thing, but they had to leave school, and that was a bad thing.
Yeah.
And so, there's kind of I don't know, schooling creates that stigma in some ways.
Yeah. Zambia had actually brought in a back-to-school policy for young mums, but the stigma often still prevented them from doing that, or they would choose to go to night classes or go to a different school, or generally they just didn't go back. So it wasn't easy once they had children to go back anyway.
I think that's one of the unhelpfulness about the whole chronological aging, because you create stigma and then essentially you're cutting off lots of routes of progression for that young person who's had a child, and it's kind of almost like you're idealising this 0 to 18. You've got to get everything in there, all of the education, all of the life progression. Like your life is going to dictate on what happens between 0 and 18, and I feel like it's an unhelpful distinction in that a girl has a child and therefore certain avenues are cut off her, but it shouldn't necessarily be that way. Like you live a long time after 18, and I think that's what was going through my mind when we were talking about the unhelpfulness of dictating the age of childhood. I think some of the young people that I worked with, they were in their early 20s, but they were still struggling with loads of challenges of living on the street, just as much as the ones who are under 18. And I guess that's a problem in the donor agenda and the NGO agenda in terms of, now you're over 15, we can't have you in a transition home anymore, you're over 18, so you're not qualified for our programs, and then you get all these early 20-somethings who are just
just briefly, because we'll certainly come back to this toward the end. Are there ways of theorising life course that can have political salience, that can convert needs into demands in a globalising world, that don't necessarily rely on chronological age? Is there scope for moving away from these sort of global standards that are getting foisted upon governments and on young people?
Just from an idea about it, it reminds me a situation in Bolivia,
in an indigenous community. We have this situation that girls on the age of 13 or 14, culturally they are supposed to begin having a sexual life, marriage and have a sexual life. And they don't want that. So they try to hide that the breasts are growing and that they menstruate. So there is this kind of women alliances between them to hide that from men. So here we have a conflict, a power relation within a community, an indigenous community, about what is the right way of living between, and then we have a gender issue. So I was wondering if in this theorizing about life course, how we manage these conflicts, these power relations, because in a single community, in a rural community, we have so many different ways of understanding life course. And if it relates to a gender perspective, in which end relates to another theme in Bolivia very sensitive, that is the collective rights of indigenous people. So now in Bolivia, the indigenous communities have the right to legislate and to, in certain degree, manage their justice system. And then we have anthropologists backing them. And the other side, there is this within the community, gender studies showing that actually we have conflicts about life course, about rights, etc. So you have feminists fighting for the girls' right of not following the cultural norms. So life courses, what is the right age to marry, to have children, or to keep studying or not, is played in political tensions that cross where you apply research, but also in terms of legislation and also in terms of cultural and social norms. So I don't know, I was with that example trying to think about this universal situated. It's such when we think it's situated, but it's very much not
tested, even though it's
there is no one idea.
Tested.
Yeah. And we have these power conflicts, power relations. So maybe this would be, if you include that view of power relations in any level of social relations. So, I don't know.
Okay, can we now actually sort of break up into groups? So I've put sort of 4 suggestions here for different groups to discuss. I haven't actually thought about how to organise this. So, are there any other issues? I mean, we've got working, sexual consent, marriage, criminal responsibility. Any other sort of suggestions of issues that where age is sort of salient? And I can see education as being one, but in some ways perhaps education intersects with those others as well. Yeah.
Well, I would say the concept of legal minority itself. How does law actually look at the understanding of minority as a legal minority? Because if we consider the domain of law, that becomes one of the essential concepts that law struggles to deal with. And then all the 3 actually, as in sexual consent, marriage, and criminal responsibility, fall under that.
Yes. I guess that is on a mission here. And yes, clearly the others will relate to it, but interestingly they relate to it differently in different contexts.
For sure.
Yeah. So should we have 5 groups or?
It's just a sort of comment. I'm wondering whether by looking at these categories, it's a sort of universalist by its nature by categorising these things as determining life course. Is there a 5th category which says let's decategorise here?
Yeah, I suppose I'm not. What I was trying to use these for is because I think they might throw up different sorts of issues, each of them. rather than trying to have a sort of generic discussion, which we've done for quite a while, but rather than having a generic discussion about age, when we actually apply it, and these are areas in which there is a lot of sort of sometimes discussion, sometimes not even much discussion, but they are, there are expectations that these are aspects of life which should be regulated by age, rather than sort of, but do they throw up different issues when we try to discuss them, I suppose? So could we have perhaps then, so how about a group talking about work over here? Maybe at the table at the back there. I'm just wondering whether to do sexual consent and marriage separately or together. But maybe sort of sexual consent over there and then marriage over in the other corner here. Running out of corners. And somewhere around here on criminal responsibility, and then another group perhaps over here on just the legal minority, yeah. So if you'd like to get into those, and then and really sort of discuss this, are there useful ways of thinking about life course that can sort of feed into international policy discussion that could lead to something that's perhaps more useful when we think about translating needs into demands. If that makes sense.